In this video, I'll be going over the basics of writing a strategic affirmative case in LD. And to do so, I'll be going over a couple of example cases that I've written throughout my career, and I'll show you what worked, what didn't, and hopefully what advice you can take away from these examples to make your affirmative cases really strong. So, when we start our affirmative case, we want to introduce the resolution. In this example, I use the words of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt to give credibility to my stance on the resolution. A crucial thing that I want you all to keep in mind is if you are using a quotation to introduce the resolution, it has to be relevant to your story and it has to be relevant to the resolution. For example, if I just dropped a quotation from Martin Luther King Jr. at the beginning of this case, that wasn't anything about inheritances or nothing about wealth accumulation, then that would obviously be inappropriate and it would take away your objectivity or neutrality on the issue. You want something that is about the resolution and that is about your story. But if you don't do so, then your case starts off on the wrong foot. Remember, you don't always need to start off with a quotation to introduce the resolution, but it's a good way to do so if you find a great quotation like the one that I'm using in this case. So the next part of our case is obviously the definition section. We define antithetical as in opposition to, and then we get to this evidence from Dr. Hyland. And this highlights something that I think is really important for all of us to remember when we're writing our affirmative cases. In this video, I'm showing you two different affirmatives that were made for two different audiences. The first, which is this one, is for the national tournament. The second is for league tournaments, state qualifiers, and the state tournament. The difference between these is that at the national tournament, judges like hearing debate about framework a lot more than judges at league tournaments. So for this affirmative, I have a very substantial justification of the framework and very substantial explanations of it. However, you guys won't need to do that when we're preparing for League 3 this year. Just remember that you should have 1 to 2 sentences explaining your value and 1 to 2 sentences explaining your value criterion. You don't need several cards like I'm going to explain right here. But I'm showing you this framework nonetheless to show you what good framework debate can look like so that you have a strong foundation of what framework should be in your affirmative case, even if it's a lot shorter than this. But before we get into the framework itself, I want to talk about how I chose to define certain words in the resolution. I think you should choose words that you don't understand upon first glance or that aren't used in your common vernacular. For example, intergenerational accumulation of wealth. I don't talk about that with anyone really in common conversation. Antithetical, not really. And democracy is something that is common, but it's also something that is up for a lot of debate. And when democracy is at the crux of the resolution, it's always a good idea to define that word that frames your debate, just to start your case on a clear and concrete understanding of this is what I'm defending, this is what this debate is about, and you want to make that clear from the first 1 minute of your case. So, because I've chosen intergenerational accumulation of wealth, antithetical, and democracy as my terms that I want to define, that's what I'll do. I defined antithetical according to Cambridge. Then I defined democracy according to James Hyland. A crucial part of this evidence is that it also serves as a justification for my value criterion. It explains that democracy is all about equality, and my value criterion is also all about equality. So you can use your definition cards to help set you up for other arguments in this debate. And in this case, I'm using this definition from James Hyland of democracy to explain why we need to focus on equality first and foremost in this debate. That brings me to my definition of intergenerational wealth accumulation, which is about inheritances essentially. Now I go to the framework proper. First, I explain what the value is. In almost every single case that you're writing your affirmative, you do not need a very substantial explanation of your value. 1 to 2 sentences is all you need. Even in this nationals case where framework's important, the value is not what you're going to really contest in this debate. It's the value criterion. Almost everyone would understand or agree to the fact that morality, justice, or democracy are really important and should be centered in our debate. But what people usually won't agree upon is how do we maximize justice, morality, or democracy. And so that's why in this case, I have a pretty substantial explanation and justification for the criterion. It's trying to ensure equality of opportunity. So, this is what I mean when I say this framework is a lot more substantial than you'd usually read. I have three justifications for it. One of them is a piece of evidence. I explain about liberty, consent, and equality, which is something you guys should not try to do in your case for the upcoming assignments in this onboarding couple weeks. But instead, just understand that this is what a good framework debate can look like if your opponent ever presses you on it, because these are excellent ideas you can talk about in your 1ARs, your 2ARs. But I think starting it in the 1AC is a little bit premature. You don't have that much time, and you want to get across your contentions more than your liberty justification or your consent justification. But crucially, in explaining these value criterion explanations, I'd like you guys to notice that I'm using a lot of syllogisms, analogies, metaphors. This first justification about liberty is something pretty abstract that not a lot of people would understand upon first glance. The argument is that individuals have to have equal opportunities to use their rights. So, if we don't have equality, then liberty is meaningless. Well, to make it so that a judge can understand that at 8 a.m. running just off coffee, we should try to add a metaphor to that to explain this in a concrete way. So I say freedom to possess property is irrelevant if certain groups don't have property to protect. By using an example, a metaphor, or some sort of syllogism, we're able to make our cases a lot more persuasive. So, whenever you're writing something that's abstract, that not everyone would understand at first glance, please try to add just half a sentence or a sentence that tries to give an example of what that means. Because all of this jargon can go over someone's head when they're listening to your case. But if you give them an example that they can latch onto that they really understand, well, that's crucial in making sure that the judge understands what you're talking about and that your case is as persuasive as possible. Just a quick note is that in this case, I use a quick formatting thing, which is I'll have a bracket and then a tab in between that. What this means in my cases is that these are pieces of evidence or arguments that I don't have to read. They're basically optional things that I'll only read in my case if I have enough time at the end or if I have a certain judge or a certain opponent. For example, if I had plenty of time in my app, I was reading a bit quickly, or I had to take out another card in this affirmative, well, I might have extra time, so I'd go back up to this evidence from Dr. Kolodny and read this. What this bracket is just giving your case a sort of modular appeal. It allows you to change it on a notice of what your opponent's doing so that your affirmative is a lot more responsive to their strategy and to what the judges want. And the same applies to this argument I have right under the Kolodny evidence, which is just an explanation for it. It's an optional piece of argumentation, which I won't always read, but it's a good thing to have in cases where you do want to read it. So, for example, if your case is running a bit over time and you've done a ton of research, but you don't have enough time to squeeze it all into your affirmative, a great thing to do is just to put brackets in front of it, just to tell yourself, oh, if I have extra time in this case, I'd love to be able to read this because it's a great argument or a great piece of evidence. But it's not the end of the world if I don't. That brings me to the meat of this case, which are the contentions. And I want you all to remember is that when you're writing your affirmative case, you should have 2 to 3 contentions. Never go over 3, never go under 2. Because if you go over 3, then you don't have enough time to develop your arguments really thoroughly. But if you go under 2, well, that just makes it seem like you're really one note. You don't have a lot of nuance in your argumentation. And it's also harder for a judge to flow just one 6-minute chunk of contention compared to 2 or 3 2-minute chunks. It just makes you seem a lot more organized and well put together in your case. So please have 2 to 3 contentions when you're writing your affirmative cases. Now, that's not the case with the negative, but for a rule of thumb, when you're affirming, that should be your format. So let's talk about the arguments that I'm reading in my first contention. It's about how wealth accumulation keeps historical inequities alive, particularly in the United States. This first piece of evidence explains that to a T. It talks about how minority groups are significantly less likely to get inheritances. And when we scroll down to the bottom of this evidence, we see that I've inserted the methodology under this piece of evidence. Now, this is an excellent thing that you guys can do to help you in cross-ex, to set up your case to be a lot more strong, and to have the highest quality evidence. When you're citing evidence from a think tank, Google Scholar, some peer-reviewed source that has a lot of statistical evidence, more often than not, that piece of evidence will have a methodology in it. And to go the extra mile to make your app really persuasive, you can add that methodology below. You shouldn't read it during your speech, but the importance of having the methodology is that a lot of debaters like to press you on, well, what are the specificities of this piece of evidence? How did the author get to these numbers? Why is this a trustworthy source? When you have the methodology, you have all that information. It makes you look incredibly credible in cross-ex, and it gives you some strongly qualified evidence to lean back on as the debate continues. So, whenever you're citing peer reviewed evidence or statistical evidence, try to go the extra mile to insert the methodology so that your evidence can get even stronger. Now, after this piece of evidence, I have my explanation of the card. And if you guys are wondering why I've bracketed my explanation, it's because at the national tournament, not all of your judges are incredibly slow, meaning that they don't really like long explanations, concrete summaries, or a lot of storytelling. So, in an instance where I'd have a more traditional, experienced judge, I probably wouldn't read my long winded explanations. But if I have a parent judge, then I might do just that. So, in your cases, you probably should always read your explanations under the card. But for the instance of this example, it wasn't necessary. So let's talk about what I particularly said in this line of argumentation after this piece of evidence. I explain the story. I say that intergenerational wealth transfers extend historically unequal factors. That's my story. Then I tie that into the value criteria and I say no matter how fair our society is today, as long as those wealth accumulations remain, unequal opportunities continue. Remember, my value criterion is ensuring equal opportunities. So I'm tying my argument back to that value criterion right here. Next, I head into my next piece of evidence, which is from the Brookings Institute. This uses something crucial, which is about how we can have concrete examples in the tags of our evidence. After we explain this Brookings Institute piece of evidence, you can see that I'm trying to make a particular reference to white and black families. I could have easily just said that socioeconomic indicators make wealth accumulation far more unequal based on racial status, something incredibly jargony like that. But when you're able to make that more concrete, you're able to name particular examples of your piece of evidence or make it a concrete metaphor. Well, that just makes your evidence a lot more digestible and persuasive. And that's what I do in this Brookings Institute evidence. Notice here that I've inserted the figure of this piece of evidence. You should insert the figures when they're relevant to the piece of evidence that you're reading. It's relevant in this case because if we read this first paragraph, it references figure 2. It explains that figure 2 shows how there's a big gap between white and black families based on inheritances. So I inserted the figure below for the exact same reason that I inserted the methodology for the evidence above this. It gives me more information to lean back on in cross-ex. It gives your evidence a lot more credibility. And if you ever show this evidence to the judge, well, they have a lot more information as to how you're getting these statistics, how credible your evidence is. It really just goes the extra mile in making sure that your affirmative case is incredibly persuasive. And I do the exact same thing with figure 3 because it's also relevant to my analysis. Next, I go to explain what this piece of evidence is making and how it factors into the story of the affirmative. Basically, I have another concrete example. Although segregation may be gone or the slave trade abolished, insofar as wealth accumulates between generations, the racial wealth gap widens. Once again, I could have easily name dropped a ton of jargon or statistics from this piece of evidence, but it's far more persuasive to name examples, concrete explanations, or analogies or metaphors to make your evidence seem a lot more down to earth. And that's all the more important when you're referencing heavily statistical evidence, which I'm doing right here. So, what I want all of you guys to do in your affirmative cases is to have these concrete explanations after every other piece of evidence that you're reading. These don't have to be super long, they can be one sentence to just half a sentence, but make sure that they're throughout your case because that really is what separates a good case from a great affirmative case. It's that concrete imagery. That brings me to the Center for American Progress Evidence, which I read right here. I have another concrete image, which is excellent. I could have just said, well, wealth accumulation makes it so that people have different educational opportunities. Instead, I say that accumulation may be the difference between graduating from college or not. That's a pretty concrete image. So try to think of an example to explain your statistical evidence, and that is really just excellent in making sure that your arguments seem persuasive, concrete, and digestible. Once again, the methodology and figures are inserted so that this piece of evidence is as credible as it can be. Finally, I wrap up this by having one more concrete image. The color of one's skin dictates his or her odds of getting a college degree. That's an excellent image which encapsulates the entire understanding of this contention, which is that intergenerational wealth accumulation is racially unequal. When you can use idioms like this, the color of one's skin, that's something that almost everyone can latch on to, understand, or it would ring a bell when they're listening to it. Try to reference those idioms when you're writing your affirmative case because it really makes it a lot more persuasive. Finally, I wrap up my contention by referencing the value criterion of equal opportunity, and I explain how this contention meets or violates the criterion. In this case, wealth accumulation violates the criterion because it's discriminatory. Now, that brings me to the second contention. Remember, all of your contentions need to logically follow each other or be related to each other in some way. This second contention does exactly that. It's both of these contentions are about historical inequities that are kept alive. The only difference is that the first contention basically sets up that argument in the United States, and the second contention explains, well, this discrimination is rampant around the world. This is a major issue that you should understand. This is an excellent way to frame your cases when we have an international topic. Remember that this resolution doesn't say if wealth accumulation is good for the American democracy, but rather it's for all democracy. When the resolution does not specify the United States, we have to assume it's about every single thing or every single international institution that's relevant. For example, it's about wealth accumulation in countries like Sweden or Switzerland or France. We need to make sure that we're covering our bases by really talking about the scope of the resolution. An excellent way to frame your contentions in the affirmative case is to similarly follow the strategy that I've implemented here. You can have a domestic contention and an international contention. This isn't the only way that you could structure your affirmative case, but it is one that is logically following each other. And it also makes sure that our story is really clear throughout both of our contentions. So, my evidence from Dr. Korak does a great job of explaining why statistical evidence is crucial in your affirmative case. You should always have some examples, some statistics, somewhere that this policy has been implemented, so that when your opponent asks you, where has this been done before, you have a clear answer. You should be falling back on qualified evidence from professors, peer reviewed studies, statistical evidence. Understand that the judge is trying to understand if your evidence is really credible. And when you are referencing statistics or really great examples, then that just gives an air of credibility to your entire contention. So your contention shouldn't just be examples or statistics, but they should have examples and statistics in them. Remember, it's not the defining trait of your contention, but it is a trait that you should have in your affirmative contentions. And that's what this evidence from Dr. Korak does. It kind of does both. It has a lot of statistical evidence in the figure that I've inserted below here, but it also has a lot of examples and references Finland, Norway, Denmark, Italy, and the United Kingdom. Remember that we should insert our figures when they're referenced in the evidence. That this evidence wouldn't really make that much sense if I didn't insert how Miles Korak got to the conclusions that he did. And he got to those conclusions by using a statistical analysis that we can see on this figure. In other words, having those notes, those sources, And those figures inserted in your evidence is just going the extra mile to really make your cases incredibly persuasive and hard to beat down if you're a negative debater. Next, I just explain what the statistic means. Clearly, these racial disparities are extended across the world. And thus, I tie that in back to the value. It's incompatible with democracy because it skews individual opportunity. Remember, you should always be referencing the criterion or the value throughout your case. Because if you just name drop the value or criterion at the end of your case, and that just sounds like you're coming out of left field, that you're not really affirming the resolution or meeting the framework that you're trying to meet this entire debate. Instead, you should have them weaved throughout, understanding that yes, the value criterion should be throughout your case, but it shouldn't be the defining feature of every piece of evidence. For example, this evidence from Dr. Semniov talks about 16 other examples of countries. The purpose of this evidence is to give a lot of examples, but it also is trying to prove the value criterion. It should be relevant in both instances. Once again, the methodology is here, and then I explain it in our last piece of concrete imagery right after this evidence about native born individuals. Now, finally, this piece of evidence from the Asian Growth Research Institute touches on one of the advanced casing techniques that I'll talk a lot more about in that lecture. But what's important here is that we have different colored highlighting for different instances of when you're reading this affirmative. The different highlighting shows different arguments that you use to beat other arguments. In the instance of this affirmative case, a really common argument was that intergenerational wealth accumulation is good, even though rich people get a lot more. The reasoning for this is that giving $1 million to like Mark Zuckerberg means a lot less to Mark Zuckerberg than giving $1,000 to a homeless person. Even though poorer people get less money from inheritances, that still is crucial for economic mobility. This piece of evidence is crucial because it preempts that argument. It essentially answers it in the blue piece of blue highlighting, but it also isn't just a preemptive piece of evidence. The green highlighting is what I would read in every instance unless I didn't have extra time. For example, I think you should think of this extra different colored highlighting is what you'd read if you have extra time and if you know your opponent's probably going to read this other argument. For example, if I was just running out of time, I might just not read this preemptive argument and then read it in the 1AR as an analytic and only read the green highlighting. This Asian Growth Research Institute evidence is a great example of preemptive evidence and modular evidence. It's modular because we have two different colored highlightings in our affirmative piece of evidence, and it's preemptive because it's answering an argument that my opponent will likely make in their next speech. Now, having preemptive and modular evidence is an incredibly powerful tool for your affirmatives. They allow you to beat back your opponent before they have time to even answer your case. It just sets you up to be on a much more powerful position in the 1AR because you don't have that much time. You have 4 minutes to answer a 7-minute 1NC. So if you're setting up your responses earlier in the debate, then you don't need to take as much time explaining those responses, which makes your job a lot easier in the 1AR. And it also helps you break down your opponent's arguments before they have the chance to make them. Now, the also dangerous part of using preemptive evidence is that it's basically useless if your opponent doesn't read the argument you're trying to preempt, which is why preemptive evidence should be used sparingly. You should use it when you basically know what the core topic arguments are, and you're almost 90% sure that they're going to read that argument. In almost every single affirmative debate I had at nationals, my opponent would probably read this argument. So I was confident that this Asian Growth Research Institute evidence would be excellent at answering that. But I think the best pieces of preemptive evidence for your affirmative case is when the evidence can stand alone even without the preemption. This Asian Growth Research Institute evidence talks about how intergenerational wealth accumulation is unequal. Then it adds on the preemptive answer to my opponent's argument. So in other words, it supports my story while also destroying my opponent's story. The best part of this evidence is that it can stand alone even if my opponent doesn't read that core argument which I'm trying to preempt. So in your affirmative cases, for our next couple meetings, try to keep in mind how you can put modular and preemptive pieces of evidence in. It's an advanced technique, but it'll go the extra mile in making sure that you get plenty of wins at our upcoming tournaments. Now, I conclude with this piece of evidence from Dr. Shelton. Now, something that I want you guys to keep in mind here is that this evidence isn't really jargony compared to my other ones. It particularly talks about examples of genocide and slavery. It is written in common terms that people would understand if they don't have a statistics degree, which is great. Your evidence should try to strive to be understandable by anyone that doesn't have a lot of qualifications. For example, on the lethal autonomous weapons topic right now, it would be great if your evidence didn't have incredible jargon in it, such that you had to have a degree in AI to understand it. You want evidence that's understandable to the judge. And some jargon is fine because you can explain that jargon after your card, but it's great to have pieces of evidence that basically speak to themselves, that the judge doesn't really need a ton of explanation afterwards to understand your point, because that's a lot more efficient for your affirmative case. So, in our cases in the upcoming weeks, we should try to have evidence that does have a lot of statistical backing and that is somewhat jargony, but also have evidence that can be understood by a common person just listening to your speech at our next CFL tournament, so that you are being time efficient in your affirmative. Now, I finish up my case by reading my conclusion. I basically tie this into unequal opportunities, referencing the value criterion. I tie it into the story about historical atrocities, and then I conclude by tying that into the value. After all of this is what a strong affirmative case can look like. And I hope that you took away some great advice from it, as we'll move on to the next affirmative case, which is written for a more CFL or state centric audience.